You all ready to join me today in our trip to outer space?
Yeah.
Albert Shivers.
The Matrix doesn't have him.
That's very true.
Come along quietly or not.
They don't have to like it, but they're gonna see what happens.
Goodbye, wimps.
And now, without further ado,
from Albert Shivers.
The general concept is that creativity flourishes in an atmosphere of freedom.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Planet Shivers podcast. I am Albert Shivers, and it is jazz musician Bill Crow who lands on Planet Shivers in this episode, and I am very excited for you to hear it. That's all I can say. I found out about Bill Crow through the PBS jazz documentary Jazz Ambassadors, which covered a multitude of musicians who toured the Soviet Union in the late 50s and early 60s. Bill Crow was the bassist for Benny Goodman during that tour. I made a short list of people who were interviewed in that documentary, and Bill Crow was on that list, and I contacted just about everybody on the list and was able to get in touch directly with Bill and have this conversation with him. As I explored his resume more, I found out that he not only played with Benny Goodman during the Soviet Union tour, he played with Stan Getz, Gerry Mulligan, was friends with jazz vocalist Dave Lambert, swapped records with Charlie Parker, and his list of accomplishments is probably as tall as his bass itself. And the bass is not the only instrument he played. He played trumpet, trombone, saxophone, sang, and did some percussion. One thing that really excited me about this story was his beginnings, which is interesting. Bill was born in 1927 in Othello, Washington, and one of my favorite parts of his story was that one of the first, if not the first, jazz he was introduced to was through his music teacher playing him West End Blues by Louis Armstrong. Anybody who knows that song and its relevance in music history knows that that's a fun one to have be your introduction to jazz. A conversation that was really meant to be just 40 minutes to an hour ended up being 2 hours. We cover Bill Crow's entire life, and that brought me to a little bit of a problem with how I was going to edit it. From the production standpoint of the show, there's one of two ways you can go about this. Two roads you can go down. You can either chop the episode up into individual stories, release them spaced out over time, maybe a little bit more palatable to do a bunch of shorties than one big one, or I could just hand you the one big one on a silver platter and say, here you go, here's everything. And that's the way I want to go about it for this. Bill's story is a detailed one, and any chopping up of it, I feel, would disrupt the wholeness of his life to hear it told from basically beginning to where he's at now. In the future, I am thinking about isolating some of the stories that are the most interesting either to me or in general and putting them out as shorts based off of this episode. But for right now, I want to give you the entire story from beginning to end, uncut. And that is what we're going to do. So before we get to Bill Crow, I just want to nudge you in the direction of my Instagram at Albert Shivers. I have a lot of new art stuff cooking, and you can check it out there. Next month, 5 of my newest pieces will be featured at the Gamut Art Gallery. These are my larger pen and ink illustrations that you'll get to see if you can make it there. And also check out the Albert Shivers Artist Patreon page If you want to throw some bucks at the show, help the production, that'd be cool. If not, just enjoy and listen. That's the best way you could support the show, is just listening and spreading it around. So with all that, let's get to my conversation with Bill Crow. It was an honor to speak to him. I was very thankful for him to give so much time for the show, and I hope you enjoy all the stories he has to tell. If you have even a small interest in jazz, this is a fantastic introduction. And if you consider yourself a jazz aficionado and a jazz expert, I bet you that you will hear some things in this episode that you may not have heard before, stories that you're not familiar with. So either way, enjoy my conversation with jazz musician and author of 2 books, Bill Crow.
Tired of having headache pain, nausea, heartburn, indigestion, upset stomach, diarrhea? Try new Pepto-Bismol chewables, made in grape, peanut butter, and cherry flavor for family and kids alike.
That's right, David. And all this and more can be found at a low price at your local pharmacy. For our southern guests, keep a lookout for the new brand, Peppy Bizmilk. Must be 18 years or older. The purchase has to be apparent before overdosing. Do not take if pregnant with triplets.
You are listening to the first station on your dial, WCNW, operating on a frequency of 1,500 kilocycles in Brooklyn, New York.
We'll start from the beginning. Tell me a little bit about where you were born.
Well, I was born in Othello, Washington, which is over in the desert country in eastern Washington. My grandfather and grandmother had a store there. He had a bad lung, so he had to live in dry climate, and that was why he chose that place. So when my mother was ready to have me, she went over there. But she and my father and the rest of the family lived in Kirkland, Washington, which is across the lake from Seattle. Okay.
And what was it that you got your musical inspiration a bit from your mother, correct?
Well, yes, she was a musician. She played the piano, and she sang very well, and she taught voice and elementary piano. She tried to teach me the piano when I was about 4, and I ran into a wall. I couldn't get both hands going. So in the 4th grade, I took up the trumpet, and in the 6th grade, I complained to my music teacher that I couldn't get enough lip to play the first parts. I wanted to play the melody. And so he looked at my teeth and he said, well, I think maybe a bigger mouthpiece would be better. So the school owns a baritone horn. Why don't you try that? And I took it home and fell in love with it. It was a really nice instrument and the parts were interesting. So, by the time I got into high school, I got an after-school job and got a good king baritone of my own. $75, I think it was. I had to pay it off one time, which established my credit.
Right. Gotcha. One other thing that stood out to me, when you were young, you remember one of the first jazz tunes you were introduced to was Louis Armstrong's West End Blues.
Yeah, that was that same teacher. I was walking by his house one day, and he waved me in, and I was very impressed that he had a record player that had records that had 2 tunes on them. We had an Edison at home that you cranked up, and one cylinder had one tune on it.
And so they didn't have a B-side? No,
it was a cylinder. You slipped it onto a sleeve, and the grooves were symmetrical, so that it was like a little, you drop the needle into the first groove, and the threaded rod would carry the needle across the entire cylinder as it spun. And everything was acoustic. There was no electricity involved. You just cranked the spring up, and you adjusted the little lever for, I never knew whether it was a tenor singing fast or a baritone singing slow.
Gotcha. So then you started collecting your own records. What were some of the, once you were introduced to jazz, what were some of the records you were picking up?
Well, when he played me that West End blues, that was because I was a trumpet player. He thought I'd be interested in that opening cadenza, which I was. It blew me away. And so I was charmed with Louis Armstrong. And fortunately, there was a little store in our small town that sold stoves and refrigerators. And in the corner, there were 78 records. And there was a little record player there that you could listen to them on to see if you wanted to buy them. And whoever was stocking his supply of records for sale had access to a lot of the small jazz labels. They had, Columbia and Victor and the major labels. But they also had Commodore and Ash and Signature and those records. So and it was a nice assortment. I didn't know anything about the different schools of jazz at that time. It was just all jazz.
Right.
So I bought, I would save up. I had a little after-school job, and records were from 35 to 75 cents, I think. So I would save up, and every couple of days I'd go down and buy another record. And I'd take it home and memorize it. You would read everything on the label and find out as much as you could about it. They used to print the names of the musicians on the label in those days. So I was introduced to Eddie Miller and Jack Teagarden and Eddie Condon and I found an album of Mary Lou Williams and Bill Coleman. And I had never heard of either of them, but from the liner notes, I found out that he had moved to Europe and was not available in this country, so this was kind of a rare recording.
Okay. Yeah, and that would be pretty early for Mary Lou Williams. Was that be early in her career?
I think so, yeah. Not as early as when she was with the Clouds of Joy, but... right in there somewhere.
Gotcha.
And then it's funny. I got all of the Benny Goodman stuff. I loved the band, but I was especially fascinated by the small groups. I thought Teddy Wilson was fantastic. Nat Cole was really my favorite piano player in those days. It seemed to me that he had. I had a couple of Art Tatum records, but that was just like impossible. You couldn't aspire to playing like Art Tatum, but you could to Nat Cole. And most of the piano players I knew tried to pick up what they could from Nat's records about how to feed for a soloist and how to voice certain things and how to swing.
Right.
So that was really nice. And then I got interested in some of the boogie woogie piano players. I bought some of those records, and one of them was Oscar Peterson. He was about 18 years old when he made his first Victor record, I think, playing boogie woogie.
Did you listen to any, by chance, Dorothy Donegan?
I never heard Dorothy until I got to New York.
Okay.
That was back in the 50s. I had never heard of her. But she was playing around town, and I heard her when I got here,
Yeah, she was somebody who really struck me as pretty incredible once I found her recordings.
Yeah, well, the women in jazz at that time were Hazel Scott, who I thought she played well, but I always thought that she should play in the dark or something. She was so busy being beautiful, Dick Perry would qualify that as having a beauty attack. But she had a lot of slick things. She'd play two pianos at once, and but Mary Lou seemed to be more just a serious player, and I really admired her playing. And then, there was a harpist, I think, with guy that had the band at the Hickory House there for a while. He had some records out. I can't think of his name at the moment. But I think his wife was a harp player.
Okay.
I heard Dave Tuff on records very early, and I admired his playing. There was just something about the spirit of his playing, and also Sid Catlett. I thought he was a wonderful drummer. I could see what with the Benny Goodman Quartet with no bass player and Gene Krupa playing drums, I could see what he was doing on the drums. It had a lot of swing to it. But when I would watch him in the movies and things like that, it always seemed like he was demonstrating what he was doing rather than just doing it, you know. I got to know him later. We were on a tour with him, and he was really a very sweet guy. But you know, he used those two white spotlights on the floor beside his drum. And when he really got into playing fast and hard, these lights would come on, and he didn't want to wear makeup. They blanched him out. They were so bright, so he would try to keep a suntan as much as he could. And when we were on the road, if the train stopped and the sun was shining, he'd be standing in the doorway, adding to his suntan.
That's amazing. So you also played in the Army band.
Yeah. When I was in high school, I had this same wonderful school teacher from the 4th grade through graduation. Al Benest was his name, and he was very encouraging. When there were two of us that played the baritone horn in the high school band. And when I saw that we were just doubling the trombones, some of the baritone parts in other arrangements had a line of their own. Quite often they were taken from orchestral arrangements, and I would get the cello part to play on baritone. So I liked that better, and if there were a lot of trombone players playing the same thing I was playing, I'd make up another part. And my partner, the other baritone player, said, "He's not playing what's written." And Vanessa said, "For him, it's okay." So that was my introduction to improvisation. And then he started a swing band. He bought a bunch of stocks, and they put this little band together to rehearse after school. And I wanted to be in it. And he said, "Well, there's no baritone horn parts, really." But my brother had gone in the Navy, and he'd left a Busher alto saxophone under his bed. So I got that out and practiced it for a couple of weeks till I could read some of the parts, whatever was in the staff, I could play. And then I started being the 3rd alto player in this swing band. But in my senior year, we merged with another high school, and about 3 good alto players came in from this other school, and I was out of a job, but our drummer had graduated, so I ran over the drum set belonged to the school, and I ran over to the filling station where he was working now and said, "Show me what you play," you know, and then I became the drummer for the swing band, and I stayed with that. After I started college, I went to the University of Washington, but I was still playing with this band because no other drummer had showed up yet. And I bought a set of drums. I found a wonderful old beat-up set of drums that somebody sold me very cheap, and kept it in my room and practiced it and drove everybody crazy. But when I went in the Army, I was thinking I would get to be a baritone horn player in some band because I didn't put down any of the other things I knew how to do. I was a printer, and I was a meat cutter. I had worked in print shops and butcher shops after school and on Saturdays. But they saw in my school records that I'd had half a year of typing, so they put me in an office.
Okay.
It took me about 6 months, I think, after my basic to find a band that I could get in. I finally got in there at Fort Lewis, Washington. And no sooner had I gotten into the band than they shipped it out to Fort Meade, Maryland. made it the second army band. But I was playing baritone horn there, and I met a cornet player who knew all. He was a moldy fig. He knew all the music from Louis Armstrong to about Muggsy Spanier, I think.
Okay.
And he could accept the Benny Goodman quartet, but he didn't like anything any more modern than that. And so he taught me that whole repertoire. I learned to my benefit, because when I got to New York, I started getting jobs with people like Jimmy McPartland and Vic Dickinson and all those people, and I knew all those tunes. It was great. But this cornet player I was playing tailgate baritone horn with him, and he finally said, "Why don't you get a valve trombone? That's more of a jazz instrument." So I did. I found a used one in Baltimore. It cost me $30, I think, an old Con. And I was playing drums in the service club band because all the other drummers in our band were either percussionists or street drummers, and they didn't want to play the trap set. So I sent for my drums at home, and I would go play these jobs. And I had a stand that I would keep the valve trombone beside me on the bandstand. And when it was a chance for me to play a chorus, I'd pick up the trombone and keep the feet working while the trumpet player came over and played time on the cymbal. Okay. And that was our system for the Army. And then when I played, we had certain concerts that we would play more like what they can now call stage bands. We had a good arranger that wrote big band charts and that kind of thing. And we'd go play concerts for hospitals, Army hospitals and things like that. And then we did a couple of shows, and there were bassoon parts, and we didn't have a bassoon player. So with a plunger and the valve trombone, I would imitate a bassoon and play all those parts. So when I got out of the Army, I came back... and instead of living at home and going to college like I had done before the Army, I moved into a houseboat on Lake Union, which was very close to the university. And it was owned by a couple of musicians, and I think there were 4 of us living in that house on a raft. And so we had jam sessions all the time in that houseboat. And I started to meet all of these musicians that were either going to college or working around New York, around Seattle. I had no idea that there was a jazz scene there until I moved there. And it turned out that there were 5 or 6 clubs that had jazz bands, and a couple of Chinese restaurants that had solo piano players. And in the black section, there was a couple of really hot clubs that I could. And in meeting all these different people, I met Quincy Jones, who was 18 at that time, still in high school, and his friend R.C., who was a blind piano player. And I never knew what his name was. It was Ray Charles, but everybody called him R.C. Okay. There you go. And it was Quincy was just starting to write then. There was a guy named Bumps Blackwell that had a big rehearsal band. And when he heard I was a trombone player, he said, "Oh, man, we need another trombone player." He says, "Come on over." And he said, "I'll write you a chart and put a solo in there for you." So that was my introduction to the black musicians in Seattle. And there was a wonderful tenor player named Gerald Brashear and a trumpet player named Floyd Stanifer. It was really nice, good music.
So was the jazz scene in Seattle like a bit more, for lack of a better phrase, underground than it was in like the biggers like New York and stuff?
Well, yeah. The liquor laws were weird in Washington State. You couldn't go to a nightclub and buy a drink. You had to bring your own bottle, and they would sell you expensive mixers. That's how they stayed alive. And the nightclubs had to close at midnight. So there was a tremendous number of after-hours clubs that I know there's a guy named Russian John that owned about 6 or 8 clubs, and the police were tight with him, but they had to come and raid one of his clubs about once a month, and it would close, and another one that had been closed for a long time would open. And so this drummer that I met, he was from Olympia, Washington. He came up to Seattle, Buzzy Bridgeford. And he'd been out on the road and had been to New York and had been friends with Bird and J.J. Johnson and Max Roach. But he'd been in an auto accident or something. And he went home to heal up and then came up to Seattle to see what was happening. And we met at one of these jam sessions. And he liked my talent, but he couldn't believe how innocent I was. So he decided he was going to hip me, And he taught me all the ins and outs about the underworld of jazz, and he was a part-time junkie, and he introduced me to all of that. Fortunately, I tried that, and I felt like I'd been poisoned, so I never wanted. I was looking for ecstasy, and I never felt so sick in my life. So I never did that again, fortunately. But he showed me about swing, and it really. I was trying to play a little drums, he had a job with an organ player, and if he had to take off to do a better job, he'd send me on in as a sub because he knew I wasn't good enough to steal his job. And in there somewhere, he really showed me what the difference was between just playing and swinging, And then he pointed out some of the drummers that I had already collected their records, and reaffirmed why they were good. People like Dave Tuff and Shadow Wilson and Joe Jones, so that when he was ready to move back to New York, he talked me into coming with him. He said, if you want to be a musician, you got to go where the music is. This is a weekend town. So we got on the bus and came to New York. I had $50 and my valve trombone, and we checked into a musician's hotel on 46th Street at that time, the Bristol, I think it was. And it was $8 for the night. And I thought, man, I can't afford this. I only have $50, So I walked around. I found Birdland. It had just opened the month before we got there. And a block west on 8th Avenue, I found a furnished room for $8 a week. And I thought, that's more like it. So then he showed me where Charlie's Tavern was. That was where all the musicians hung out at that time, in the Roseland building. And he would take me in there and introduce me to people. He knew a lot of people. I met Dave Lambert and Neil Hefti. And it was funny with Neil. I was doing a demo for him with Dave Lambert. I was singing with Dave Lambert's quartet.
Okay.
And we walk into the studio, and it's like a demo for his wife, and Fran Warren. And Dave says hello to Neil, and he says, and Bill Crow. And he says, Bill Crow, then who's Brew Moore? He thought he'd been saying a load of brew all this time. So anyway, I got my toes into the water in New York, and I was taking my valve trombone around to some jam sessions and things and playing, And then Buzzy got a summer job. Gene Rowland got the job. It was a hotel way up in Tupper Lake, New York, almost to the Canadian border. And then he got a summer job in 1950. And he hired Buzzy and a couple of other guys, and they went up there. And then the next week, Buzzy's back in New York. And I said, what happened? And he said, Gene had a fight with the owner's wife on opening night and walked out and abandoned the band. So I went to the owner and said, I can get you a band. You don't have to be stuck without a band. So I didn't care for the guys that Gene had hired, and I came back to New York to get the band together. So he got Freddie Greenwell, who was a wonderful Seattle tenor player. And and Marty Bell was the trumpet player, and an interesting character, John Benson Brooks, was the piano player on this job. And after I got to know him, I found out he was a real intellectual and mystic, and he had written some pop songs, Just As Though You Were Here, and You Came a Long Way from St. Louis, and he'd written some arrangements for the Randy Brooks band. He wasn't related to them, even though they had the same name. But he had this big apartment. I think his wife worked for the American Legion or something like that, and was keeping the family going that way. And he was making some small royalties from his songwriting, but he'd been a recluse. I don't think he'd been out of his apartment for 6 or 7 years. And Buzzy talked him into coming up and taking this summer job on piano, which was really rare for him. So when he left to go back up there, he said to me, if you want to have a nice weekend in the mountains, hitchhike up, and I'll put you up in my room for the weekend, and you can bring your horn and sit in, it'll be nice. So I did that, and the night that I went down and sat in and played, he went to the owner and said, sounds good with the extra horn, right? And the owner said, yeah, it does. We were playing 3-part harmony, And he said, well, this guy's very much in demand in New York, but his doctor found a little spot on his lung, and he thinks he should stay in the mountain air for a while. Maybe you could get him, So, I don't know, he offered me $15 or $20 a week, something like that, and room and board. Well, nobody had made any kind of offer. This was like manna from heaven, So I started playing with these guys, and the boss wouldn't let him hire a bass player because he figured like 2 drums and piano was enough. You didn't need another rhythm instrument. So, and Buzzy hated to play without a bass player. So he went out and found this kid that lived in Tupper Lake that owned a K bass, and he only used it during the school year. So he rented it from him for $20 for the summer. And he put it on the bandstand. I come down one night and I said, oh, bass player? And he said, no, I just got this bass. He said, when you're not playing the trombone, you got to try to play it. So they gaslighted me into being a bass player. Every time I'd put the bass down to pick up the trombone, they would all groan. When I picked up the bass, they would be enthusiastic. Freddie had a tape recorder, and he would call me in the daytime and say, hey, listen to this chorus. You really sound like Ray Brown here,
So, had you played much bass prior to that?
Not at all. I had fooled around with one in the music room in high school. I knew what the tuning was, but I never was interested in it. And but I was really playing with some good players on this band, and I wanted to get good on this instrument, So I had no idea there was a fingering system. I just found the notes as I went along, and by the end of the summer, I was playing well enough to offer myself as a bass player when I came back to New York. Except I didn't have a bass, but I found a guy on 6th Avenue, a little music store, that had an old beat-up bass that he rented out. And I could give him $5 for the weekend. I could have this bass and go play club dates, And then I would go to jam sessions and take my trombone along. But if the bass player got tired, which quite often they would, there'd be one bass player and 10 saxophone players, And they would all want to take 10 choruses. So Teddy Kotick would let me play on his bass quite often. He would be at jam sessions, and there was another Spanish bass player that would let me play his bass. So then on the grapevine, I found this guy up in the Bronx who had a K bass that he was willing to sell for $75. And I only had 5 to give him, I think, 5 or 10. And I asked him to hold it for me, and he said he would. And then I took a job with Mike Riley and his Musical Maniacs with John Brooks on piano, just the trio. Mike was a trombone player and clown. And we went out and did all kinds of little funny towns like Monessen, Pennsylvania, and Troy, New York. And he was paying me $80 a week on the road, and I was able to save $5 every week and send it to this guy until I finally owned the bass. And then I quit that job, and I was a drummer and singer on that job. And then that just started my life as a bass player. I started getting club dates, and it was funny. I was walking up 7th Avenue one day, and I run into this trumpet player that I used to work for in Seattle, Ward Cole. He had left to go with Ted Weems' band, I think, and he was working in New York. And he said, "Hey, you know, I know you double on a couple of instruments. I know a guy that needs doublers. You know, all the guys in his band double on different things." He gives me the name, and I call him up, a guy named Glenn Moore. And yes, he needed me. I joined his band. He had about a 6-piece band, I guess, and everybody doubled on different stuff. And we went up and played a week in Toronto, and we played a week in Philadelphia, and then he got some kind of a TV. I think the guy was learning how to shoot movies. It was like real amateur night, but it got better as we went along because he was learning his craft. And they finally got this. It was an entertaining film that he did of this band and a comic that was this guy's partner. So he wanted to keep us together till he saw if he could peddle us to some of the TV stations. And he happened to be the guy who booked the bands on the boats that went to South America on the Moore McCormick lines. So he pulled a band off of one of the boats and put us on there. It was a 38-day trip down and back. And that would keep us together until he could see what he did with this film. So that was a great experience. I got to see a foreign country, and I rescued some of the high school Spanish that I had not paid much attention to when I took that course. And when we came back, nothing had happened, so that band broke up. But it had gotten me established. Dave Lambert was helping me find some work, and I finally I met Teddy Charles. He had a trio, and his bass player had just gotten a good job. Teddy rehearsed every day and worked about once a month. So that was perfect for me. I would go up to his apartment every day, and he would teach me all the bebop changes. I knew all of the Dixieland tunes, but I didn't know. I had started to collect Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie records when I was in the Army, but I didn't really know all of that material. But he showed me what the right tunes, right chords to around about midnight were, and things like that. And when we did play jobs, it was like straight bebop, guitar, bass, and vibes. And I scuffled along with that for it was like several months, I guess, that we did that. And in between, Dave Lambert was scuffling at that time. He'd lost a lot of his connections when Buddy Stewart died. And so he was showing me how to scuffle. He had a cheap apartment, and I found one. And for a while I was staying with him. And then he would, we would go paint somebody's apartment or babysit their kids or move people from one apartment to another or babysit their car or all kinds of things. We would just make nickels and dimes, but we were keeping each other alive, And finally, I was getting enough work that I could afford an apartment of my own, and found one on Cornelia Street. It started out, it was $50 a month as a studio apartment. It was really half of an old cold water flat. And the guy upstairs, after I moved in, he came down and he said, I think they're ripping us off here. I think this is supposed to be a rent-controlled building, you know. So he said, I'll check into this. So he called somebody downtown, and this guy shows up at my door with a clipboard, and he looks around and says, studio apartment, are they kidding? And he writes something and goes away. And the next week I got a notice that my rent from now on, with the increase, would be $28.80 a month.
Okay.
So that saved me. It was the apartment had a bathtub in the kitchen with a lid on it, you know, and a refrigerator and hot water and a little fireplace. There was no heat in the room except this fireplace. But that got me through. If I got a job that took me on the road, I could just lock the door at those prices. Right. You know, I didn't have to find a couple of times friends of mine that were in the same situation I was. If I was out of town, I'd let them stay there. Jim Hall stayed there for about a month. Freddie Greenwell stayed there for a while, and I stayed in that apartment for about 10 years. It was great. But eventually, through Teddy, his guitar player went with Benny Goodman, and Jimmy Rainey was at loose ends because he'd been working with Stan Getz, and Stan had gone to the West Coast by himself for the summer. And so Jimmy came and played with us. And then when Stan came back, he called Jimmy up and said, I got a job in Boston for a week, and Roy Haynes he lives up there, so he's going to be the drummer. And I got a piano player, so get a bass player and come on up, you know. So Jimmy got me the job, and that was my first really good break. I played that week with Stan, and then he kept me on for 6 months. I played Birdland, and we recorded, and then Jimmy left. He got a steady job at the Blue Angel, and we were a quartet with Duke Jordan and Kenny Clark for a little while. Mm-hmm. And then they went to do something else, and he started a new band with Al Levitt and Johnny Williams, and he asked me he said, well, I gotta start a new band. Who should we get? You know, so I said, well, I heard this trombone player, Bob Brookmeyer, at Ned Flory's place, and he's really wonderful. So he calls Bob up, and Bob said, oh, I'm glad to have the job, but I gotta give this band 2 weeks notice before I can leave. You know, he was working with some big band as a piano player. So Johnny Mandel was an old friend of Stan, so he called Johnny up, and he was just trying to write for Elliot Lawrence at the time, but he was a good trombone player. So he said, John, come, I got these 2 weeks in Baltimore and Washington. Why don't you come and do it? So he came out with us, and he played so well. Stan said, if you want to stay on the band, I can just tell Bob to forget it, and you can be my trombone player. And John says, oh man, if I come out on the road, I'll never get any writing done. I got a lot of stuff to write, So he didn't take the job, and Bob did. And then that rhythm section never really gelled. John Williams wanted to be right up on the front end of the beat, and he was like a Horace Silver fan. And Al Levitt was trying to relax things, and I was in between. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't have enough experience, So Stan decided to go back with Teddy Kotick, who was playing with Claude Thornhill then. And I went back to New York and found out that they were looking for a bass player for Claude's band, so I took that job. And I spent the summer in 1953 on the road doing one-nighters with Claude.
Wow. So what exactly in that late 40s, early 50s, what was the jazz culture like in New York City, and being a part of it?
Well, there was I was lucky. I was a new bass player, and so I'd be standing in Charlie's Tavern, trying to see who was around that I knew and try to meet new people. And somebody would come in and say, I need a bass player for Saturday night. I'd take it, And then the grapevine would tell you where the jam sessions were. Like Jimmy Nepper and Joe Maney had a place at 136th Street that was in the basement, and then the room was actually out under the street. So you could play in there all night and nobody would hear you. You know, it was really great. And that was where I met Charlie Parker. He knew those guys, and he used to drop in and play once in a while. Now, I was such a young bass player, I never told Parker that I played anything. You know, I just became friends with him. Right. But I didn't want to admit that I was a player because I was afraid of him. But he was such a generous guy. I never saw him make anybody feel bad about their playing or anything like that. You know, he always encouraged everybody to play. I understand from stories other people told me that when he was needing to find some junk and didn't have any money, he could be as irresponsible as junkies are, you know. But all the times that I was ever with him and around him, he was just the kindest man, and he had a sweet nature, and he was interested in everything. So, I mean, if you were a rocket scientist or a classical composer or whatever, he would be interested in what you do, and he'd be able to talk to you about it, you know.
Wow.
He came over to my house one time and was looking through my record collection, and he picked out all of the things that he hadn't heard, you know, a couple of classical things, and he wanted to hear those things, you know. And I remember one time Buddy Jones had an apartment right across the street from Birdland upstairs. And I was up there with Buddy and Neil Friel and Buzzy and Freddie Greenwell. And Bird came up. I know we were just smoking some pot or something like that. And he noticed that Neil had an exercise book from France that had a lot of curlicues in it and things. He was just standing there looking at it. And then we went over to hear him at Birdland afterwards when the gig started. And he's using these figures that he just looked at as part of his solos, you know. He was a real sponge. He would hear something and well, Buddy Jones used to have a collection of tapes from a tape recorder that he had from jam sessions where Bird was playing, and there was one tune where he's playing on a tune that modulates every 4 bars, and he played this figure that fit the first 4 bars so perfectly. It was just, he found this wonderful melody that was in there, and then when it modulated to the next 4 bars, he figured out a way to play it almost in the same key that he had played it in the first 4 bars, but altering a couple of notes so that it fit the new chords, and it still was like a marvelous invention. And then the third time he started to do it, and he realized there's no way he's going to get this in here, so he just went on and played something else. But every time he would come around to that spot in his chorus, on the next chorus, you'd see him like fooling around with those notes to see, and then he'd go ahead and play something else. But he was keeping track of 2 things at once, you know. Well, Al Cohn said it best. He said, people don't understand. He said, it's not that Charlie Parker was better than everybody else. He said it's that there was everybody else, and then there was Charlie Parker, you know. That he was just a different kind of musician that nobody had ever seen before. So it was really such a thrill to be around him. And you could go down to Bird, you know, when I got here, the first week I'm in town, Bird was at Birdland. And you could get in for 75 cents, I think, at that time. So that's just where I went every night. It was like going to school, you know.
Right.
His band was Red Rodney, Bud Powell, Roy Haynes, Tommy Potter. And then the house band was Al Haig, Curly Russell, Max Roach, Miles Davis, Sonny Stitt, and J.J. Johnson.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
So I'm sitting in the peanut gallery like I'm going to school, you know. And then I look around and I said, "Why? There's Lester Young sitting over there. There's Ben Webster sitting over there. There's Joe Jones over there." I just thought New York was always going to be like that.
Yeah. One other name that jumped out to me as we were talking was Dave Lambert. I'm a big fan of Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, and then later Lambert, Hendricks, and Bavon. If you could talk a little bit about Dave Lambert. And
well, when I met him, he was just breaking up with his wife. They were living down on Monroe Street. They had a $25 a month apartment there, I think, and he had a 4-year-old daughter, you know. And I started hanging out with them, and they knew so many interesting people. You know, he would take me to parties and to jam sessions and to other people's houses, and I would meet all these interesting people. I had started out, I got a job in a print shop up in the Bronx just to survive. It was a terrible job. I knew how to feed a hand press and set up type for it, you know. But these people are all screaming at each other, and it was a long trip up there on the subway, and they were only paying me $30 a week, out of which I was paying. Well, I had found a drummer to live with that had a $12 a week a month apartment. So I was paying $6 a month to live, and I had started taking lessons with Lenny Tristano on the Valve trombone, and that meant a trip out to Forest Hills once a week, and I had to pay him $10. And so, you know, I was just getting by, and there was one spring day when I just couldn't go back to work in that awful place. So I walked down to the Lower East Side and visited Davey Lambert instead. And I never did go back to that way. He showed me how to scuffle, you know. He showed me how to find a cheap place to live and how to find cheap food to eat and how to make $1 or $2 different ways. So he got me some work as a singer, and he was an old friend of John Benson Brooks's. So when I came back from that summer job, I didn't have any place to stay. John put me up for about 2 months. He had a big apartment, and he had a spare room there. And that was really, and he had a grand piano and a record collection, you know, so I really spent some good days up there. And then Dave found this basement apartment on 10th Street, and he needed somebody to help him with the rent, so I moved in. He had the bed, and I had the couch, and right around that time, he had a little. It was only about a 60 key piano, I guess it was. They used to use them for songwriters that were plugging their tunes. They would push them out on the dance floor. They would play their songs. So there was a place that he could rent this for real cheap, a monthly rent, and we were paying really cheap rent. This was like a basement that used to be a coal bin, and it was now a rentable room. And we were getting our electricity from the typewriter shop in front. We ran a wire in there, and we'd give the guy $5 every once in a while, because we didn't use anything more than lights and playing the record player. And we had a jukebox in there for a while. A friend of ours was a singer that had inherited this old Seabird jukebox. I guess that was our record player. Moved it into this basement. And then Brew Moore and Zoot and a whole bunch of friends of Dave's started to come down there. I met all those guys, and we played together. Then after I after I came back from that boat trip to Argentina and back, Dave told me that he had gotten used to living by himself, and he was making a little more money now, so he would appreciate it if I would find my own place, which I did. I found that place on Cornelia Street, and eventually found him a place in the next building. Okay. So we both lived on Cornelia Street for about 10 years, I guess. And it was funny, there was a place on Washington Square South called the Open Door. Bird used to play in there on Sundays, and I played in there with Don Joseph and Drew Moore a few times. And then they tore it down because NYU owned that property, and they were building a new law building or something. So when they were tearing it down, Dave's apartment had a very poor fireplace in it, very tiny. So we went and took bricks from this building that they were taking apart. We would carry like 8 bricks at a time over. It was 2 or 3 blocks from the Open Door over to Cornelia Street. And we got enough bricks up there to his apartment that he could build an arch and a fire pit, that's probably still there.
So what's now, most of your career was spent, as far as I can tell, with Gerry Mulligan. And if you could speak about him a little bit. And
well, it was a period of about 10 years there. I met Gerry at one of those jam sessions, and there was a woman named Gail Madden that he was going with at that time. I don't know if he's going with her, but they were like partners in him stopping being a junkie. Okay. And she originally was going to have a brownstone and be the therapist that was going to get all these talented junkies off of junk. She was talking about Bird and I don't know, Stan Levy and JJ, a whole bunch of different guys.
It was very prevalent at that time, right?
Yeah, Zoot Sims said heroin was very popular in those days. But the whole thing fell apart when the woman that was going to bankroll this thing had a fight with Gail, and they broke up. So she just latched on to Gerry, and I would see them on gigs. Like, he would just be the baritone player, and she would be there, and he would give her a pair of maracas to play or something. I never could figure that out. But then we heard that they were on their way to California hitchhiking. So that was interesting news. Mm-hmm. And right around the time that Johnny Mandel came with Stan Getz, when I was with him, we hear the Gerry Mulligan Chet Baker records for the first time on the radio. And we were charmed with that music. And in fact, Stan said to some downbeat writer that he would like to have a band with Gerry and Chet and him and Brookmeyer. He thought that would be a great sextet. Mm-hmm. And the writer put that in downbeat as though it was a fait accompli, and Gerry took a burn. He said, "Tell Stan to go get his own band," But actually, that was pretty much the sextet that Gerry put together when I joined him. I had been working with let's see. When I came out of the Thornhill band, he went on weekends, and Terry Gibbs was looking for a bass player, so I went with him. And Terry Pollard was his piano player at that time, and Frank DeVito was the drummer. And we would do a week at a time in all of the jazz cities, Boston, Baltimore, Toronto, Chicago, Minneapolis, and we even did East St. Louis, I think. That was a terrible job. And then there was a hiatus in his work. But while we were doing that, we did one concert with Marion McPartland's trio when Vinnie Burke was with her. And Ahmad Jamal, who I'd never heard of before. I thought he was just like a cocktail piano player at that time. He hadn't found his groove yet, you know. But from that one time that Marion heard me play with Terry, when Vinnie decided to leave, she called me up, and it turned out to be I was at Liberty. I just lost a job with Jerry Wald, and he had something booked that fell through. So I went with her at the Hickory House, and that was my first good job in town. It paid a decent salary, and here I was at home every night, you know. So, and I was playing with Joe Morello, which was really nice. And Marion, you know, I was still a self-taught bass player. I would play up the E string till I came to A, and then I'd play up the A string till I came to D, and then I'd go up the G string as far as I could go. But I wasn't playing across the board much. I'd started to with Claude's band, because he had a theme song that went through a 10th with no open strings. It was in D flat. Okay. And I had to sit down and really figure out how other bass players were doing that, and that got me started playing across the board a little bit. So Marion really put me through the changes, because she loved to play in every key. You know, she would, if she played a ballad especially, we were sure to get into some sharp keys and multi-flat keys and all that, and I would suffer, you know, trying to find those notes, and I could hear what I wanted to play, but the fingering was really difficult, and the 2 years that I was with her, I really got to be a much better player. And then Jerry came east with this sextet that he had put together in California, except that Idris Suleiman had been his trumpet player, and he was leaving to do something else. So John Erdley came, who had played with Jerry on the coast. And Brookmeyer was there, and Zoot was there, and Dave Bailey was the drummer, and Peck Morrison had been the bass player, but he was going with Johnny Hodges or somebody, so they needed a bass player, and Brookmeyer recommended me. So I was really happy at the Hickory House, but I couldn't turn down a chance to play with Bob and Zoot, especially. I didn't really know Jerry's playing that well at the time.
Right.
But so I gave Marion my 2 weeks' notice and started rehearsing with Jerry's sextet. And he had an album that he had started that Peck was on half of, and I finished it up. And then and I got to meet Gil Evans on that date, because he'd written a tune for the sextet. And then we did a European tour, and that was opened my eyes. You know, we went over on the Andrea Doria, which sank the next year.
Wow, okay.
And we started in Napoli, and we did a tour of Italy, and then they put us on a bus and sent us to Paris. Well, that was an interesting trip from Naples to where were we? One of the northern Italian cities. We went from there to Paris, so we got to see all that countryside between Italy and Paris.
Yeah.
And then they put us we were in the Olympia Theater just as one of the acts. They had a dog act and a comedian and a couple of dancers, and the headliner was Jacqueline Francois, who was a French-Canadian singer that was very popular in France. And the second headliners that opened the second act were the brother dancers.
This might be a little too far back, but not the Nicholas brothers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And Harold and Fayard. And so they had a regular French pit band there that played, and we just came out and played a couple of tunes. We were one of the things on the bill, you know.
Okay.
But for the Nicholas brothers, they had insisted that they have a jazz drummer. So Kansas Fields was their drummer. He was living in Paris then. And Kansas became our guide of Paris, you know, between him and Henri Renaud and his wife. I had met Henri on a record date. He came over and recorded El Hague, and I was on that date. Mm-hmm. And so they really showed us all the places to hang out and to eat and to jam sessions and all that sort of thing. And we were there for a couple of weeks. And on our off day, they would take us up to some other small town and put us in a movie theater or something like that for a concert. You know? So that was really a thrilling trip. And then we came back on one of the British Queens. And when we told Henri Renaud's wife that we were going on an English boat back to New York, she said, "Oh, you poor things, pack a lunch." It was funny because on the Italian line, the quality of the food and the wine was just perfect. You know, they would give you small portions of delicious things to eat and change the wine every so often. And, there was one kind of wine that I loved so much that I wrote everything down on the label. When I got back to New York, I went into a wine store and said, "Can you find this for me?" And he looked it up. He said, "You'll never get this." He said, "The Italian line buys the entire product of that vineyard." So anyway, but the attitude in the British lines was to give you huge quantities of food, but it was not too well prepared, you know. Right. So anyway, that was and then when we got back to New York, Zoot had decided to stay in Paris. They treated him so well while he was there that he decided to stay in Paris. And John Erday had some business in Florida or something, so we became a quartet with Brookmeyer. And I stayed with that group until Gerry got a little crazy and we had a fight, and I quit. Okay. And then I was doing some off-Broadway shows and club dates, and once in a while, like a week with Alan Zoot or something like that, down at the Half Note. And then some time passed, and Gerry called me up and said, "I'm putting a new quartet together with Art Farmer. You want to be on it?" And I said, "Of course." And so I joined that group, and Dave Bailey was the drummer. And that lasted for a year or so, I guess. And then Gerry got a chance to do a movie, and I had just fallen in love, and I didn't want to go to California, so I left the group there. Okay. And they ended up breaking up in California anyway, because Art Farmer went with the Jazz Tet, and he and Benny Golson started this new group. And Gerry was doing different rehearsal bands and stuff out there while he was doing this movie. So I didn't work with him again until he put the big band, well, with his movie money, he felt he could afford a big band. Okay. And he tried several different versions of it, and he finally made Brookmeyer the straw boss, and Bob did the hiring. And he's the one that put that band together that became the Concert Jazz Band. And they went, Zoot didn't want to be in the section. He didn't want to be reading parts. And Gerry said, "Well, how about coming with the band as the featured soloist?" And Zoot said, "Oh, yeah, okay." So they did a European tour. And that Mel Lewis and Buddy Clark with the rhythm section. And was like Nick Travis and Connie Candoli and Don Ferrara were the three trumpets. And after the European tour, Connie and Buddy Clark went home to California, and Mel Lewis decided to stay in New York. Mm-hmm. So Gerry needed a bass player and a trumpet player, so he hired me and Clark. And we just were so thrilled with that band. It was so good. The charts were wonderful. The band was really hitting together, and Clark brought he's got such a big bag of tricks, and is so musical and so personal. Mm-hmm. So he became one of our featured soloists. And I mean, that band was so good that guys would turn down record dates in order to play at the Vanguard for not much money, you know, that kind of thing. Wow. But and Gerry had a deal with Norman Granz that if Norman could have the record dates and the European tours, he would pick up the losses for the band on jobs that didn't pay enough to really pay the band in this country, you know. Mm. So we were down in Florida playing in the Hell Week that they always have when the colleges are on vacation.
Okay, yeah.
And they were trying to keep them from sleeping and having sex on the beach, so they were having jazz concerts and whatever they could think of to entertain these kids, and we were one of the entertainments. So while we're down there, Gerry gets a message from Norman Granz that he's selling Verve Records and the deal is off. So Gerry looks at his book and says, I don't have anything booked for the big band until next month in Boston. He said, I can't afford this, you know. So he breaks up the band. And we went back to playing as a quartet with Brookmeyer. But we loved that band so much that we would rehearse once a week up at Lynn Oliver's place in New York. And the arrangers were still bringing in charts, and everybody was having a good time rehearsing with the band. And that was when we first met Gary McFarland. Brookmeyer had met him there was an arranger's office that what was his name? Emil Charlotte. And all the guys like Quincy Jones was very good at booking jobs, and he would take so much work he couldn't possibly do it all, you know, in time. So he would get people like Brookmeyer and Ralph Burns and Hale Rood and all these ghostwriters. He would sketch out things, and they would write the charts for him, you know. And so Gerry came to one of those. Right. Just a minute, I gotta answer my phone.
In 1958, you played with Duke Ellington's orchestra.
Yeah.
How did you get into that, and what was it like to play in that band for a show?
Well, there was a concert at Lewis on Stadium, which was up near Columbia University. It was an outdoor stadium. And I'd played several jazz concerts up there. So we had this, I was with Gerry's band and Duke's, the two bands were on this concert. And Duke had asked if he could be on first because he had someplace to be that evening. He wanted to get out of there. So his band is all set up, and we're waiting in the wings, you know, and his bass player doesn't show up, Jimmy Woody. So Duke's looking at his watch, and he's looking at the sky. He's afraid it's going to rain. Mm-hmm. Then he comes over to me and grabs me by the sleeve and says, "Come with me." So I'm standing there with my bass. I go down, and I start to get the book out. It's laying on the floor underneath the bass stand. And Britt Woodman says, who's right behind me, says, "Don't do that. That's all been changed, you know." So I just look around, and I said, "No, well, what are we going to?" He said, "Just hang around in B flat for a while Duke talks, and we'll tell you when to change, you know." So Duke is making his announcements and all, and I'm just playing with the rhythm section, you know, and Sam Woodyard is way up on the top of the risers. He's not close to me at all, but he's easy to play with, so I'm not having any trouble there. And it's thrilling to be standing there among all these heroes of mine, Johnny Hodges, so Duke kicks off some tunes, and he has sense enough to go back into the early book, so it would be tunes I would know, you know, and I didn't have any trouble playing, and I'm having a wonderful time. And then when he wants to play a ballad that he knows I don't know, the piano was right next to the bass. Okay. He comes right to the piano, and I'm standing there looking at the keyboard, you know, to see where his hands are, and he just points at my bass note. He doesn't play it. He just points at it, and I play it, and he sees that that's going to work. So through the whole tune, every time the chord changes, he just points to the bass, and I play it. And so I'm standing there grinning like a fool, and Gerry gets upset about it. When I'm finished and go back up to set up with his band, he says to me, "How come you don't have that much fun playing with me?" You know, and I said, "Oh, come on, man! I said, you play with Duke all the time. Let me have my fun, you know." Yeah. And so he says something to Duke about tiring out his bass player. You know? But that was a thrilling day. I saw Duke that same summer. We did a festival that George Wein was trying out in French Lick, Indiana. It was a place that had been lily white until they did this thing. So he made everybody down there assure him that there would be no bullshit, you know. Right. And so we're all down there, and that was when Art Farmer was still with us. Let's see, Art and Dave and me and Gerry, and Art and Dave were a little worried about going in the pool because there's all of that fuss about black people, you know, going in swimming pools. So they were considering whether to go up and get their bathing suits or not. And here comes Dizzy out of the elevator, and he's wearing a Sheraton bath towel as though it's a cape, and it's fastened with a scarab pin that he's picked up in Egypt someplace, and he's wearing a braided cap that he picked up in Uzbekistan someplace, and he's got a cigarette holder that's ivory with a cigarette in it, and a Blaupunkt portable radio. And he's wearing slippers that the toes curl up. They probably got in Persia, and puts all this stuff down by a chair. And then he sees Jimmy McPartland standing there in his bathing suit. So he shucks his towel, and he grabs Jimmy, and they both get up on the diving board and jump in the pool and integrate the pool. So I'm laughing about this, and I'm getting ready to go get my bathing suit, and the elevator door opens, and Duke walks out, and he says, Mr. Crow, he said, I never had the opportunity to remunerate you for your excellent services there at Louison Stadium. And I said, Duke, that was the thrill of my life. You please be my guest. And he went on into dinner, you know. But that was really nice. I did get to. I had met Duke before that, because when I was with Marion at the Hickory House, Duke's publicist Joe Morgan had worked out a deal with the Hickory House that if they could eat there for nothing, that he would publicize the Hickory House. He'd get the name in Walter Winchell's column or something like that. And so Duke came in every now and then and had dinner there. And sometimes, he always came over and said hello. And a couple of times Marion coaxed him into coming and sitting in with Joe and me, you know. So I had played with him before. But that was that band. And God, I must say that it's just still thrills me to my socks when I listen to that band. There was a little where Johnny Hodges is playing one of the ballads that he became famous for. I forget the name now. But evidently it was the first time that he played it in public because Duke is standing there holding the music for him, you know. And the band just sounded so good. Johnny sounded so good. Since I was a kid in high school, I was in love with Johnny Hodges' sound and the way he played. So that when I first heard Bird, I wasn't too impressed. I was impressed with how he got over the horn, but it didn't sound like Johnny Hodges. That was my ideal, you know. But then I finally got used to Bird's sound and grew to love it. But,
yeah, wow. I'd also like to talk a little bit about your Soviet Union tour with Benny Goodman.
Well, that was my first encounter with Benny. His manager called me up and said, Benny would like you to come up and play at Lynn Oliver's studio. And I said, okay. So I went up there, and John Bunch was the piano player, and he had 2 or 3 young drummers that I hadn't met before that he seemed to be auditioning. You know, they took turns playing. And he'd spend a lot of time looking for a reed, and he would say, do you know this tune or do you know that tune? And they were all standards that I knew. So I started making jokes like, how about Hello Central, Give Me Heaven, because my daddy's there, you know, do you know that tune? And I couldn't get a laugh out of him. He didn't see anything funny about it. So I just went ahead and played, you know, and, you know, he would play like halfway through a tune sometimes and stop, and or he'd play one chorus, or he'd play a couple of choruses, and then he finally said, okay, boys, I guess that's it. And he packed up and left. So about a month later, I called up his office and talked to his manager, and I said, you know, I never got paid for that rehearsal. And he says, oh, that wasn't a rehearsal, it was a jam session. I said, geez, I wish I had known. I would have taken a chorus. You know? So then... this is, a year or so later, I get a call from, now by this time I've exchanged enough Benny Goodman stories with other musicians that worked for him that I know a little bit about, that he strikes a hard bargain, but as a result, he ends up paying more for most of his bands than Woody would have to, for example.
Okay.
And that he's always on the phone when you're talking to his manager, you know, he's listening in. Mm-hmm. So the manager calls me and says, Benny's going to do this tour of Russia and wants to know if you're interested. And I was very interested, and he says he wants to know how much you would want. And I said, well, you know, I had to think about what Gerry had paid me for European tours and things like that, and figured that it should be a little more than that. So I asked for $300 a week. I thought that was fair. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, we'll get back to you. And well, that meant he had to talk to Benny. And he calls me back and he says, Benny says that's okay, but he has to have the record date. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you wouldn't get paid for the record date because they're going to record it in, you know, while you're playing concerts in Russia. I said, okay. So I didn't know that was against union regulations, and so he calls a couple of rehearsals, and we're going through all this new music that's just been written. He's gotten several of the arrangers around town to write stuff. And Brookmeyer was one of them. He'd brought in one chart that he'd written. And it was for a standard tune, you know. I can't remember what it was, but it was a tune from Benny's knowledge of popular tunes, you know. He would know it. And Benny says to Bob, what's the tempo, Bob? And Bob kicks off tempo. like this, and then he kicks off a tempo that's about half that, and the arrangement didn't work at that tempo. We played it once, and we never played it again, you know. Johnny Carisi came in with an arrangement that he was slick. He knew that Benny had done Sing, Sing, Sing was like a big hit for him. And the format was like an old Jewish melody that they turned into a swing tune, you know, and there was room for Benny to play with the tom-toms and all. So he took a Bulgar melody that he found and did the same thing. He made like a band arrangement and then tom-toms and place for Benny to go as long as he wanted to with the drums, and then a shout chorus out, you know. So Benny liked that. He called it the Vulgar Bulgar. And so we played a couple of concerts on the way out to the West Coast and did a week at the Seattle World's Fair as a break-in before we went to Russia. And at the concerts at the Seattle World's Fair, he was playing his number almost every day. And one day, when Mel starts with the tom-toms, he looks at Zoot and says, "Zoot, you play." So Zoot gets up and plays. That wasn't really his thing to play with the tom-toms, but he played a little something, you know. And then Benny played his thing, and we took it out, you know. So the next time, he says, "Zoot, you play." And then he says to Phil, "Phil, you play something." Phil stood up and played something that was breathtaking. It was just such a beautiful glass house construction. And Benny's standing there. The whole band is standing there with their mouths hanging open. It's just, and the only sensible thing to do would have been to take it out from there, because you're not gonna put anything on top of that. It was just one of Phil's best choruses, and as a result, Benny couldn't think of anything except how well Phil had played on his own chorus. He's just tweedling around and not really thinking about the music, you know, and he finally takes it out. We never played that song again.
Wow. So once you come back from that tour, what was the remainder of your musician career like? Did you continue to play in New York?
Oh yeah. When we got off the plane, Jack Lewis was waiting for us. He had a record date that Al Cohn had written the charts, and Phil Woods was going to play the clarinet. So I liked that album. That was great. That was Eddie Costa's last album. You know, we didn't have any of the piano players that had been with us were Teddy Wilson and John Bunch, and they had both stayed in Paris. And Joe Newman and Joe Wilder had gone to Sweden because their wives were from there and had gone home while we were in Russia. So they got Marky Markowitz, I think. It wasn't as big a band as Benny's band had been for that record date, but it was mostly guys from the tour, you know. Well, I came back and I did some more things with Gerry, and then I quit him again because he got nuts, and I came back to New York, and he was on his way to the West Coast. I left in Chicago and came home, and I was playing a lot with Al and Zoot. And there was just a lot of different stuff. Roger Kellaway had a couple of jobs that I did, and I got in. I was walking up the street and ran into Kay Winding. Now, I had done the last jobs that he and Jay had when they had Jay and Kay. I finished up like a week in Basin Street West and a record date and the Newport Jazz Festival, and then they were breaking that band up. It was funny. We were playing in Roseland, in the old Roseland building, Basin Street West. And Carl Fontana had come in because Kay was putting together a 4-trombone band as soon as this band was over with, and they were starting to rehearse. So Carl had come into town, and he came in that night and had his trombone with him, and Kay motions him up. And it happened to be Kenny Clark was the drummer, and he had a toothache, and he was feeling bad, and Dick Katz was the piano player. I had just replaced whoever the previous bass player had been. And Jay and Kay were like phoning in their parts. They'd been playing these tunes. They had hits, you know, and they had to play them over and over again. And Carl came up and he sat in. He knew these tunes because they were hits. So he faked a third part to the 2-part harmony that Jay had written for them. And it perked them right up. And then he took the first chorus, and he played so good that they both really took care of business. You know, they it brought them into focus immediately. And Kenny Clark right away, as soon as they started playing good, he forgot about his toothache and started to play. So we had a great night, you know. So anyway, when that was all over, sometime later, I ran into Kay on the street, and he said, "Hey, the Playboy Club finally got their cabaret license, so we're putting in full bands up there now. You know, I'd like you to come and work one of the rooms, you know, with that. It's like a steady gig." Well, I was doing weekends at Condon's at that time. They wouldn't hire a bass player for a whole week. They would just hire you on the busy nights, you know. That was how Dave McKenna got to playing walking bass lines, because when he was there as the house piano player, it was like 3 nights a week that he didn't have a bass player. So anyway, I quit that job and went to the Playboy Club. I was playing with Walter Norris's quartet. And when we first started there, we were playing jazz for dancing on the 5th floor. There was music on every floor. And Kay had the band downstairs. He had a great band. He had Earl May, Al Gaffa, Monty Alexander, and Al Foster. And when Monty Alexander left, Larry Willis came in. So that was a hot band. And I got to listen to them. That was nice. But our band started out with Walter and me and Jerome Richardson and Bobby Donaldson. And Jerome and Bobby soon had other fish to fry and quit that job. Because it was just like a dance band, you know, but playing jazz tunes. And so we got Joe Farrell and Ray Mosca. And Joe was just fabulous. I loved the way he played. But wasn't too long before they cut us down to a trio, and we had to do without the tenor player. And then they would put us on weekends, and then they'd have us back full time, and then they'd have like private parties we needed to play, and in and out. So there was sometimes that I would just either I had the time off, or I would send in a sub and go play with Al and Zoot down the half note, you know, for a week. But I stayed on that job. Finally, they put us in a showroom, and we would just play for a singer and a comic, different one each week, you know. And we stayed there, oh God, 5 years, I guess. And then Walter had a run-in with somebody from the main office in Chicago, and they fired us. And then I looked around. There wasn't much happening in the jazz world. I wasn't getting any nibbles from anybody. So I started taking club dates. And the club date business was really hot then, and there was a lot of work. And I graduated to the Peter Duchin band, very, very quickly. And I spent a couple of years with Peter. It was just weekends, mostly flying out of town to rich places like the King Ranch in Texas, Fort Lauderdale country clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very good band, but it was a club date band, you know. Peter could play, but he would get either drunk or distracted, and he didn't play that well, you know. But the rest of the band was great. So the first year I was with him, he was impressed with the people I had worked with, and I got along with him okay. But then the second year, I'd only been playing with him, and he wasn't so impressed. And he started to have opinions about bass lines that I didn't think he was entitled to, so I left. Mm-hmm. And then I lucked into some Broadway shows.
Okay.
And I did that for about 10 years. So I did a couple of long runs. Well, the first ones I did, first one only lasted 13 weeks, I think. And the second one lasted 5 weeks. And then I got one that lasted 2 years. And then when that was over, I did a summer of flops, but they were consecutive, so it was like having a steady job.
Right.
And then I caught a dinner theater that was 7 minutes from my house in Nanuet, New York. And I did that for about a year. I was just playing musicals. Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. It started out playing just for singers. We did Billy Eckstein and a couple of people. Then they changed it to a dinner theater, and we did like Irene and different musicals like that with like a 5 or 6 piece band. And but it was so close to home. When Johnny Lesko called me to do a Broadway show again. Mm-hmm. I said, "Geez, you know, I'm right close to home here, and if you figure in the transportation and the parking and all of that I have to pay if I come into the city, and they're paying us to play for dancing extra on the weekends here, you know, it's almost the same money." And Johnny says, "Well, I'll have them put a tuba part in the overture, and that'll give you the double, you know." And I said, "Well, let me get back to you." So I talked to the guy I was working for in Nanuet, and he said, "Oh, take it." He said, "If the show doesn't run, you can always come back here." Great.
Yeah.
So I took the show. It was 42nd Street. It ran for 8.5 years. And the job that I was leaving folded that winter. So
it worked out.
I was very lucky I made the move. But at that time, I was on the theater committee with Local 802, and I helped negotiate some contracts, one of which was a provision that we had been trying to get for years of the right to take off. They used to have really mediocre bands in the pits in New York because you couldn't take off. And as the shows ran longer and longer, if you stayed with a show for a couple of years, you'd be out of the music business if you hadn't kept any of your other contacts going, you know.
Right.
So we told them, look, we've already negotiated vacation time, and if somebody gets sick, they have to have a sub. It's to your advantage, and at no cost to you, we can have prepared subs that are ready to take our places, and we should have the right to take off if we get a record date or, you know, a concert or something like that. So, and there was one guy on management's side who had been a musician and understood what we were saying. And he offered us 50%. He said, all right, you can be off 50% of the time and still own the show. But the conductor has to have approval of your sub. And that was perfect. It was exactly what we wanted. Every negotiation after that, they wanted some of that back. And we would say, where are the grievances? You know, nobody has complained about the way this is working. And it's still that way. It's really great.
Wow. So you also authored 2 books.
Yeah.
and done a good bit more writing as well. Can people find these books still?
Yeah, they're still available. One of the books did so well that they still keep it in stock. The first one, Jazz Anecdotes, was republished as a paperback as Jazz Anecdotes Second Time Around, in which I added some more stories.
Okay.
But the second book, it had gone into, like if you look for it on their website, it would say out of print or no, they never used that term. It was always that it was out of stock.
Okay.
So I called up the guy that had gotten me to do the books in the first place was a jazz fan. He's one of the vice presidents there, and I called him up and I said, "Look, if you're not gonna print any more copies of my book, can I have the copyright back, because I'd like to peddle it to some other publishers?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we could do that." But he said, "I think you're eligible for print on demand." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, we print up a bunch of covers, and when somebody orders the book, we can print it so fast and get it to them, and then it can be out in a week." It's just the new computer world.
Yeah.
So, because when I first started to write that book, I was writing on a very early Radio Shack model computer that I had, and I sent them. I think it was floppy disks of the manuscript, and they had to translate them to linotype, I guess, and there were a lot of mistakes made in the translation. So when I looked at the proofs and I corrected all of these mistakes, it didn't occur to me that I should see another set of proofs. When I first got the book, I opened the book and there's a misspelled word, the first thing I see, and so I got that all straightened out in the paperback version. Because the computers had improved now. They could take it directly from what I sent them on a disk to the linotype. So those two books are still I still see them available on Amazon and on Oxford's website.
Okay, great.
The way I got started was when we a bunch of us that were in the theater business at that time got really disgusted with the old administration at Local 802. They were we had things happen like the president of the union would come to a negotiation and meet with the chief negotiator before the committee got there. We would find him coming out of the guy's office lighting a cigar when we showed up, and he would give them our bottom line, just trying to hurry things up,
Right.
So there were so many things like that in so many different fields of music that we decided it was time to change the administration. So John Glazell called me up one day and said, "How would you like to be president of the union?" I said, "No way." And he said, "Well, if I can't find somebody else to do it," he said, "I'll do it myself." But he said, "We got to make some changes in the bylaws first." So he did. He packed some bylaw meetings with working musicians that wanted to change, and we changed the bylaws so that the officers used to be, you couldn't be any kind of an officer on the board and still be in the music business. And he said, "That's ridiculous. We need people that are in touch with what's going on, So he changed it so that the top 4 officers couldn't take jobs in the music business, but the rest of the board, as long as they weren't contractors or leaders, could be in the music business. Well, right away, I was willing to run for a job on the board. And when he got people from the symphony and from the theater and from jazz, and we all got elected. It was a wild change. It had never happened before. So once we got elected, John said to me, "How'd you like to write a column for the monthly paper?" And I said, "I know exactly the column I'd like to write." I said, "Every time musicians get together in the band room or on the bus, they start telling stories about each other. And somebody always says, somebody should write these down." I said, "Let me be the guy, you know." Okay. So my first column explained that, and then I wrote a few funny stories that I'd either heard or been part of. And everybody got the idea immediately, and I started getting mail from all over the world with musician stories, you know. So that was 1983. I'm still writing that column every month.
Wow. That's great.
So this guy, Sheldon Meyer, that was one of the vice presidents at Oxford University Press, was a jazz fan, and he had already collected Gene Lees and Whitney Bayliot and Ira Gittler, several different jazz writers to be published with Oxford. And Oxford had done anecdotes collections from the opera and from literature and from the military. And he said, "Why shouldn't we have one from jazz?" So he talked all to put a book like this together, and they all pointed at me because of my column. So he called me up, and I sent him some back columns, and he said, "Oh yes, let's do this." So he gave me a nice advance, and I got a new computer, and I started accumulating. First, I went to Lincoln Center and went through the jazz library there. And then I found the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers had a great collection. So once a week, I go down there and spend the day reading stuff and extracting stories. And they had just inherited the oral history collection that Marshall Stearns had started. Okay. Was intended for the Smithsonian, I think, but they ended up with it. So I listened to all that stuff or read transcripts that had been made. And, you know, some guys told stories and other guys didn't, but all the ones I could find, I collected and just poured them into my computer. It took me about 2 years, I guess, of collecting. I was looking at back issues of Downbeat and Metronome and magazines that had gone out of print, you know, wonderful stuff, and books that had gone out of print. So when it came time to put the book together, I realized that the stuff that was from my own experience had a little different tone to it, and I had so much other stuff. I just put that stuff all aside. And when the first book was successful, I said, you know, I think I got another book. And I told Sheldon about it. Oh, yes. So he gave me an even better advance. And that one, I didn't have to research so much because it was all mostly from my own memory. And so I got that out in a year, I think. And but then the thing that I found out on the first book, that after the book was finished, I had to go get permission for all of the things that I had extracted from other publications. That was some job.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it took me about 6 months.
Wow. Well, Bill, we're just about out of time, but this has been such a great conversation. I've loved hearing your stories. I've been such a big jazz fan for a while now, and to hear about your career and how long it's spanned has really been a pleasure.
How did you get started?
Oh, I got started. My grandfather was a youth of the 20s and 30s, and when I was young, I'd spend a lot of time with him. My mother would drop me off there while she was working or doing whatever she needed to do, and I'd generally spend the night. And I'd get up in the morning to him tuned into either the jazz radio station or him playing records. He was playing mainly the big band type stuff. Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Woody Herman, that whole group. He was very big into the Mills Brothers. That's my earliest memory of jazz, is the Mills Brothers and hearing I'll Be Around and Paper Doll.
Yeah.
And that sort of just, it all always stuck with me. And then when I was old enough to start collecting my own music, I eventually kind of blew through what was popular for my age group pretty quickly. I didn't find much interest there. Some things, but not much. And then landed on jazz, and off I went. So that was, for the most part, that's in a nutshell. I've been hooked ever since.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky when I came to New York. I thought I'd missed everything because the street was dead by 1950. There was only Jimmy Ryan's left on the street, and all those other clubs were now either Chinese restaurants or strip clubs,
Okay.
And, but Birdland had just opened, and Snooki's was on 46th Street, and I think, while I was still in the Army, I got to go to Bop City and the Royal Roost. They were still open. I came up on a 3-day pass and got to hear Dizzy's Big Band and stuff like that, And but there was just so much going on in New York. It was really a nice time. I could go over and hear Oscar Pettiford, and I could afford to go in the place.
Right.
They didn't charge you an arm and a leg to hear those bands. There was a little club on 54th Street near 8th Avenue called Le Downbeat, which was different from the Downbeat that was on 52nd Street. And Barbara Carroll had the house trio there with her husband was the bass player, and Eddie Wasserman, I think. Herbie Wasserman was the drummer. And then there was a stage there, and it was big enough for a little bigger group. So when Oscar Pettiford had that 6-piece band of his, he was in there, and I was paying attention to bass players by then, so I really loved watching him. He played at Snooki's a lot too, and I played in there with Stan Getz one time too at the Downbeat. It's just wonderful, all the music that this city has seen.
Yeah. Now I'm like 10-15 minutes away from the Deerhead, where I live.
Oh, nice.
Have you ever played at the Deerhead?
Sure. Bob Keller and I can't think of the other tenor player's name, put together some of the library from Zoot and Al, and we played that up there with Irving Green's son played the piano, and Bill Goodman, I think, played drums.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I did. There's a couple of like local bands. I do visual art, is my main deal, and I've done a couple of like poster art for Deerhead, and an album cover or two, and done a bunch of like classic jazz pen and ink drawings that have been hanging around town and down in Delaware Water Gap too. So it's music's probably like my biggest inspiration with the other art stuff that I do, and jazz has seeped into the front of most of it. Like even my approach to my illustrations is a little jazz-like. I come up with, my structure or the head arrangement of my drawing, and then leave space in there to improvise artistically with how I want to do it. So even to that degree, it's seeped into my daily life and my creativity.
It's too bad there's no market for album covers anymore.
I know.
Bert Goldblatt was an interesting thing. The first, when LPs were still 10-inch LPs, he did a number of graphic drawings that I didn't care for at all. He concentrated on the folds in somebody's crotch and their hand. I said, what is he interested in? But then when he changed and got a camera and started shooting album covers with a camera, he was brilliant. He got some covers that were just really wonderful moments, and that one that I used for the cover of my book was of Roy Eldridge whispering into Lester Young's ear and Lester grinning. And I asked Roy one time, I said, "Do you remember what you were telling Lester?" And he said, "No, but it must have been good." But that's a perfect moment in jazz.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to that episode of the Planet Shivers podcast. It was great to talk to Bill, as I said in the beginning. It was an honor to have him on. I hope you enjoyed his stories. Bill is still out there playing music. You can still see Bill Crow play, and you can find both of his books, Jazz Anecdotes and From Birdland to Broadway, on Amazon. Also, go check out Bill Crow's website. You'll find out other things that he's working on, as well as where he might be playing and what he's up to. It has been an incredible journey for this podcast to have hit episode 80, and I am thrilled to hit episode 80 with Bill Crow as the guest. And you've not heard the last from Bill Crow. Like I said, I want to divvy up some of these stories and throw them back at you. We have a lot of new, fun, exciting guests and ideas coming up. We got some old guests coming back, new guests coming on, and more great conversations to be had. Keep following the podcast. You know, I appreciate everybody who listens. And if you're new to this, you could find this episode and more on all major podcast platforms and YouTube with video. That means Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and a whole lot of others, plus YouTube with video. For this episode, there's video. I spoke with Bill Crow over Zoom, so you get to see our faces while we talk. So when you're done listening, you are done listening to this one, go check out the video as well. Until the next episode, please take care of yourself and take care of somebody else. Catch you next time.